Pixie Dust. Click the annotated buttons at the top of your screen to skip to different sections of this tutorial. To make Pixie Dust, we're going to use Maya's nParticles in the sprite render mode. We're going to generate our images for the sprites using a point light and OptiEffects, and then we'll write some expressions to control their rotation and size over lifespan. Now there are things to be aware of when using sprites, namely that they don't render in software. They do render in Mental Ray, however Mental Ray does not support the per particle attribute called sprite num.pp. That's the attribute we're going to be used to randomly assign the images we're about to make, so that means we'll be rendering in hardware, and I will be demonstrating how to render in the old but trusted hardware render buffer once we get that far. Alright, there's one more thing we need to talk about before we get too far, and that's how sprites handle images with alphas in them. Let me quickly create a particle to demonstrate what I'm talking about here. What's important to know is that whatever color your sprite image is, by default is going to get multiplied over this color here in shading of your particle. If you go down to shading tab, there's this color. So by default, if you have a white image, it's going to be multiplied over this red or blue depending on its ID. So long story short, if you want to control the color here in Maya, your sprite images that you create have to be white, and then you can use this ramp to control their color. If you want the color just to be in the image and you don't want to change it here in Maya on the fly, then this ramp here just has to be pure white. So you would delete one color and change it to white. So for the purposes of this tutorial, I'm going to be controlling the color here in Maya. Alright, so let's make our images. I'm going to quickly go to my emitter and turn its rate to 0, so that's not in the way. I'm going to create a point light, and I'm going to switch to my front camera. I'm going to turn on the resolution gate. Quickly set up my resolution to be 512 squared. Alright, and to get kind of a pixely or a pixie type image, we can add to this. I'm going to open up my hypershade and start typing OptiEffects, OP, and it's here, this node right here, OptiEffects. So what we're going to do, if we go to our lights tab, we select our light and go down to light effects tab, and in the light glow we middle mouse drag our OptiEffects, then we can go up and hit render, and we get kind of a pixie type image. So these are the images we're going to be using. By default that doesn't look bad actually, so I'm going to save that right away. And remember, I'm going to be controlling the color within Maya, so I want my image to be white. So I'm going to have it be a TIFF, and I'm going to put it in source images, call it Pixie 1. Now to change how this looks, we'll get our hyper shade back out and select the optical effect. And a quick way you can kind of check stuff out is to do a image IPR, image preview, so you can select that. So now anytime you change anything, it'll automatically update. So let's do one with 5. And you can see my start points are 5. That's fine. I'm not going to get too crazy on these images because it's going to be pretty boring to watch me make these. Alright, so I made 5 images like this. There's quite a few attributes to play with. Glow intensity. If I bring that back up, you can watch how it spreads and stuff. There's a lot of stuff down there to play with. We don't really need these anymore, so I'm going to delete those. And let's set up the particle shader. And I'm going to create a new Lambert. And we'll attach our images. Here's Somers's. I just have my 5 images. And then we will turn on use image sequence. Now here's where I will delete this expression. At frame 1 I'm going to set a key, and I had 5 images, so I'm going to go to frame 5, change this to 5, and set another key. And in here I'm going to turn on use interactive sequence caching. This will help it read the images and know which image to assign when we call for them later. So sequence starts 1, end is 5, and we want it by 1. Alright, and that's fine. So I'm going to select my particle shape from my outliner and change its shading type to Sprites. Now if I go back to my perspective view and we play it a little bit, we first have to turn our rate back on. And I'm going to quickly turn off their collisions so it runs a little faster. And now when we play, we'll have some sprites in our scene. So if I hit render, we're in software, and like I said earlier, they don't render in software, so we'll switch it to hardware, and we still don't see anything. And that's because we don't have our shader assigned. So I will assign our new shader. And this time when we render, we're getting our sprites. So let's get them to choose our images randomly. So way down in add dynamic attributes, I'll hit general, and in particle tab I will add the sprite num.pp, and this will tell us which image to choose at creation. So let's create a creation expression for it. Copy the name, paste it, and it equals a random value between 0 and 5 just to make sure we get all of them. And we'll create that. If I go back, add a few more frames and hit play, you can see that we have our different images here. So here's a 4 star, here's a 6 one. So now they're choosing our images randomly. So to get a pixie dust like effect, we're probably going to want them to rotate at different speeds in different directions. We're going to want them to maybe scale up over time, and we're probably going to want them to fade off over time as well. So first let's get them to rotate in opposite directions and at random speeds. So we're going to add a few more custom attributes. We will first add in the particle tab the sprite twist pp, and we'll create a custom one for speed called rotation speed. Make sure it's a per particle attribute. We'll add that. So first, write a creation for sprite twist pp, and we'll say that at creation each sprite is rotated anywhere between 0 and 360 degrees. Make sure I have it written right. Okay. And then for our rotation speed, we want each particle to have a value between -10 and 10. So now in our creation of our sprite twist, we're going to take whatever it was and add that value assigned at creation. So plus equals rotation speed. If we hit create and we rewind and play, my frame rate's probably terrible, I apologize for that, but they are rotating at different speeds. Some are going clockwise because they got a negative value, some are going counterclockwise because they got a positive value, and depending on what that value is controlling their speed in that direction. Alright, so now let's get them to scale up over time. And since we're using sprites, normally in nParticle stuff there's this radius scale graph right here, but it ignores that since we're using sprites. So to get that working, we're going to add another general particle attribute in the particle tab, and it will be called sprite scale x pp and sprite scale y pp. So each direction in x and y gets its own little expression. So we want them, let's say, to be born at 0 and get bigger until the moment they die. So let's copy scale x pp. So at creation we want them everything to be 0, and to make sure our sprites are square we'll just have scale y be the same as x. Okay. Now if we want them to scale at different speeds, like some get bigger faster than others, we'll add a scale speed just like we added a rotation speed. So again, add dynamic attributes, general. This time we'll add a new one called scale speed. Make sure it's per particle attribute. Okay. And we'll find it and we'll write a creation expression on that. We'll say scale speed equals a random value between 0.1 and 0.2. So in the runtime, just like with our twist, we'll have scale x, plus equals scale speed, and to make sure they stay square we'll have y equal x again. And I'll be providing links to all the expressions in this, so don't worry about all this typing I'm doing. Just it's important to understand why I'm doing this, so if this doesn't make sense, leave in the comments what you need help with and I'll try and explain it. Alright, so now if you probably won't be able to see again because my frame rate's terrible, but if I pause it you can see that over time they're getting bigger. And one fortunate thing is that they will, if I get my attribute editor out, they will obey the opacity graph of nParticles. So if you want them, let's have their lifespan be a random range between 2 seconds, give or take 0.3 seconds. And we want them to fade off over time. So we'll go under our shading tab, find our opacity graph. Here it is, our opacity scale. And just before they die, I'll have them be all the way transparent. and they're born fully opaque. And then in the nucleus, to get this kind of looking like pixie dust, right now it looks like, I don't know, snow or something. I'm going to turn off the gravity, and I'm going to add a field, turbulence field. Turn its frequency up pretty high. And we'll see what that looks like. So, looks like they're not quite living long enough. So I'm going to increase their lifespan to, let's do 8 seconds. Maybe we'll add some keyframes on our... As I said before, they will render in hardware, but I've been having some troubles lately with that. So one thing that's always worked for me is the hardware render buffer, so that can come in useful when other things are giving you trouble. So to get these rendered, we'll go to Window, Rendering Editors. Way down at the bottom is the hardware render buffer. So first, under cameras, you would pick your camera. I only have the 4 defaults, so we'll leave it at perspective. Render, we'll go to Attributes, and in here, these by default will just write to your image directory of your project, so make sure you have your project set correctly. If there's a subfolder within your images folder, you could write like Sprites / image name or something like that. But if this subfolder doesn't exist, this won't work and your images won't render anywhere. So just to be safe for now, I'm just going to call it Sprites, and I'll make sure I have my name, number, and extension. I prefer TIFFs. We'll do 100 frames, and under resolution there's a pretty good list of dimensions that you'll probably be rendering at. I'm going to choose HD 1920 by 1080. If you want a custom resolution, just keep in mind that this first thing is the name. So I would go and just pick a random one. And then this is the name, and these are the actual dimensions you'll be rendering at. And then this is the pixel aspect ratio. So just keep that in mind if you need a custom render resolution that isn't listed. For the alpha source, hardware alpha is usually fine. Sometimes luminance works if you need that. I've never done either, or I've only used those two and they worked fine for me. Scrolling down further, I leave these at default. Texturing, yes. Full image resolution, so it actually renders the resolution you set. And geometry mask, I'm going to leave that checked on. However, it doesn't really matter for me, because what it does is if you had, say, a character in your scene and you wanted just the pixie dust passed for compositing reasons, anything that's geometry is going to be black holed, or you won't be able to see it. It'll block anything that goes behind it, but it won't show up in the alpha or the regular render. So other than that, that should be fine. I'm going to go to render and hit render sequence, and you can see it goes pretty fast. And if you're rendering this and you're watching this and you're saying that's not anything what it looks like, don't worry, this is kind of a glitchy, weird thing that happens, so it's not actually the images that are being written, so don't worry about that too much. So I'm going to let this finish rendering, and I'll come back when it's done. Here's what the render looks like. Nothing too fancy, but we didn't really spend too much time on our sprite images. I didn't spend that much time getting the effect looking that great. One thing I did notice is I didn't change the color over time like I had planned. So all you have to do is pump a color in here, and since our lifespan, if you remember, is a random range, that we want our normalized age, so each particle gets to this color before it dies, and the same thing with our opacity graph. Otherwise they all kind of cut off. So here's a render of what that looks like with the blue. Nothing super fancy, but you should have what you need to make your own pixie dust effect. So if you liked it, please subscribe and share and all that fun stuff so I can make some more tutorials for you guys. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you next time.